Wow, this is so amazing to look at right now. Talking and having conversations is really important, and I think having them in a sort of casual way is important too. And I think that when I look at my life and the things that I do, I don't know that there's anything I do as much as tell stories and talk. Part of that is because I literally talk a lot. I have a group of friends that are nodding over here, and it's like, yes, I know. But I also find that I talk when I'm dreaming. You probably talk when you're dreaming. You know, that there's this storyline going on in the background. And that my events in life don't seem to matter as much to me until I can tell them to somebody else and tell my story. And then when I hear somebody telling a story that I'm in it and I feel like a character in their movie, I kind of feel cool, and I really like that. And so today, as I talk about story, I want you to keep that in your mind about the role that story has played in your life, telling them, being in them, dreaming in them, and what have you. And the first story I want to share with you is a story, and it is about a little boy named Jaime, and it's about his mom, and it's about me. And it was my first experience teaching. I decided I was going to try teaching kindergarten briefly, very briefly. As you heard, I now teach kindergarten, college. No, just kidding. I thought, is there a difference? So kindergarten was a unique experience. And one part of the winter, I taught in Denver Public Schools. And it was very, very cold out. We were about 2 blocks away from the projects. And this little boy came in one morning to the kindergarten classroom, and he had a coat on that was a little too small, so he looked a little like the kid from the Christmas Story, and walking in. And in one hand, he had a little, like a Safeway sack or a plastic grocery sack, and in the other hand, he had a fast food wrapper. And he walked in, and he stood there. And it was quite obvious that he had kind of not figured out what to do next. And so I walked up to Jaime to help him out, and I unzipped his coat, and I realized that he was holding on to both things very tightly. So I took his sack, and I realized very quickly that was his backpack, and I hung it up. And then I took the wrapper that he was carrying, and okay, we're supposed to stay in the circle. It's not going to work. Anyway, I shot a basket across the room, actually, and I am not coordinated, and it actually went into the trash can. And so I did my little ooh, 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 ooh. Now you know why the heels are off. And so as I did my little victory dance, and I was really excited, and got the class together, I noticed that Jaime was not himself that day, that he was kind of quiet and withdrawn, and as the day went on, it seemed that he was getting more and more and more sad. And so I made a mental note to find his mother and talk to his mother and figure out what was going on. The school day ended, and she came in, and other parents came in, and I did not have to wait to find her. She booked it over to me, and she walked up, and she looked at me, and she said, "What did you do?" And I had this kind of, I was going to talk to you. And she said, "My boy draws you a picture, and you throw it away in front of the whole class." And I thought, oh, no. I went to fix-it mode, right? No. Here, okay, this is the convenient part. But it was the trash can over there, okay. So I went and I retrieved the picture, and I'm feeling all proud of myself because I'm about to show her, no, it's just a wrapper. And I kind of stopped, and I started to unwrap it, and she said to me, "You think we have money in our family for paper every time my boy wants to draw a picture?" And it really floored me. And as I opened up the McDonald's wrapper, I looked inside, and surely there was this little tiny stick figure drawing of the hair and the obligatory skirt, and then a little boy in our hands where they touched were a heart. And that meant so much to me. I wish I still had the paper. Unfortunately, I had a house flood. But it probably would have been one of my most treasured, frameable, preserving kinds of things. And that story really stuck with me and defined a lot about my life. In particular, it changed my relationship to stories in general. I ended up being a person who studies mythology, and I study people's stories. And this story of Jaime taught me a very valuable truth about how most of us are involved in understanding myths and in understanding other cultures' stories. If they're packaged oddly, we have a tendency to throw them away. We have a tendency, when we go into understanding stories, to look more at the packaging of how the story is told than what is in the story. And as that stayed with me, and I began to think about my responsibility in myth work and in cultural preservation, I began to think perhaps we should start learning to have conversations where we dig past awkward packaging, where we listen to the stories that are told a little slower, with a few more ums, a little crazier than they actually happened. You know, if we really listened to some of these things, to excavate from them a deeper understanding. And as time passed, I realized the hero of the story of Jaime wasn't me for realizing this. It was his mom, to me. It was his mom's willingness to confront me and make sure her kid was understood that really stuck with me. All over the world, there are groups of people who are living lives that are threatened. Lots of tribal people, as the world goes global, more and more people groups are living on a way that is not sustainable, and their cultures are going away as they go away. And so that is the group that I am, or the category of work that I'm really passionate about, is this idea of how do we help preserve these cultures. I want to introduce you to the Ayore tribe just briefly, because we're going to learn one of their stories here in a few moments. And the Ayore tribe is a group of about 4,000 people that live between Bolivia and Paraguay along the Chaco border. And they're a group of people whose way of life is increasingly less likely to be able to be passed down generation after generation after generation. And it was my privilege to spend my upbringing years involved with the Ayore in a way that I don't remember not having Ayore in my life. And so as I begin to think about how I have worked with their stories and used this idea from my lesson from Jaime, I realized that there is this tendency whenever we're studying a group like this to try to preserve in order to conserve, rather than engage, rather than building relationship, rather than having conversations, rather than getting involved in actually knowing who people are. We like to just canonize, capture, and pin to the wall our collection of who these people are and what their stories are. And it's my passion to think that perhaps if we began telling each other's stories, listening to each other's stories, investigating each other's stories, that we would strike up the kind of relationship that doesn't just preserve to conserve, but really moves us into a reason of relationship to collaborate what their next journey piece looks like. The story I want to share with you is oddly packaged. And I want to introduce the characters to you. We have a tapir. I didn't know how many of you knew what a tapir looks like, so this is a tapir with our family pet. It's a young tapir because it has its spots, and it's a really old picture, so pretend it's Instagrammed. Stories, it's all in the wordsmithing. And this is a tejon, also Instagrammed, right? With one of the Ayore men and kind of a raccoon-like little animal that lives peaceably in the Chaco forests. So I want to tell you the story of the tapir and the tejon as it might be told if you were sitting around with some of the Ayore and myself. But I will use English because I think that's easier for the most part. Once, long ago, in the Nupabetna, the time before time, when people and things were changing in and out of their forms, and animals were becoming Ayore, and Ayore were becoming animals, and it was the beginning of all the way that things would come to be. There was a young man, and he had wandered off, and he had not marked his trail very well. And when he got to a point in the forest where he was no longer sure where he was going to be, he found himself doing the only noble thing you can do, which is to die well, and he leaned himself up against a tree and decided to go to sleep, because if you ever are wandering around in a thick forest by yourself, it's kind of a death sentence. And so he did what he did, and he balled himself up, and he thought he would die. But then a funny thing happened. He woke up, and he looked at his nose, and it was twitching. And he looked at his hands, and they were little paws, and he had become a tejon. And as a little tejon, he began to look around the forest with different eyes, and along came the big and mighty tapir. And it walked up to the tejon, and it looked at the tejon, and it said, "Little tejon, climb on my back." And so the little tejon climbed on his back, pues. And they began to walk around the forest and walk around the forest. And after a little while, the tejon's stomach said, "Just," and the little tapir said, or the big tapir said, "What did you say?" And the little tejon said, "I didn't say anything." And the tapir said, "Yes, you did. I heard you." And the little tejon said, "I am hungry." And the tapir said, "Well then, crawl down off of my back." So the little tejon scampered down, and the tapir balled himself up, and he pulled in great and mighty energy, and he passed a mighty wind. And in the wake of his wind, out came all the root things good for eating. Out came the camote, the sweet potato. Out came the mandioca, the manioc. Out came the water potato and the potato and all the root things good for eating. And that little tejon, he dove in and he ate. And he was full. So he pulled himself back up on the tapir, and they began to ride around the forest. And after a little while, the tejon's stomach said, "Just," and the tapir said, "What did you say?" And the little tejon said, "I didn't say anything." And the tapir said, "Yes, you did. I heard you." And the little tejon said, "Well, I am hungry." And so he climbed off the tapir's back, and the tapir balled himself up, and he pulled in energy, and he passed a mighty wind. And in the wake of his wind, out came all the bean things good for eating. Out came the legumes and the beans and the black beans and red beans and all the bean things good for eating. And the little tejon dove in and he was full. So this goes on through all the categories of edible things. Commercial interruption. Back to our show. And so the little tejon got back up on the back of the tapir, nice and full. And they began to walk around the forest. And they walked around the forest. And they walked around the forest. And the tejon looked at his stomach. And the tapir listened for the tejon. And the tapir said, "Little tejon, come off my back." So the little tejon scrambled down. And the tapir said, "Little tejon, you are ready. Here's the tree where I found you. Curl up, go to sleep. And when you wake, you will be Ayore. And you will find your way back to your people, and you will tell them the story. And in the future, whenever you need to have the garden foods, and you want them to bloom, and you want good things for your food, you tell the story, and you will have the food." And so the little tejon went to sleep next to the tree. And when he woke up, he was Ayore. And he found his way right back into the camp, and he came to all of them, and he said, "Gay buggy waha!" And all the people heard him, and they came around, and they said, "Hey, Nia." He said, "Gay buggy waha, I have come to you." And they said, "Hey, Nia, so you've come." And they gathered around, and he began to tell them a story of how he fell asleep next to a tree, and he woke up as a tejon, and he was not sure what to do, and then he would tell the story all over again. And when I first read this myth, I wasn't sure what to do with it. I'm not sure you know what to do with it. I warned you, it is packaged a little bit oddly, right? And it's interesting for us to begin to think about, well, what does that look like if this is the McDonald's wrapper around a picture that's meaningful? What are some of the things that are contained in this story that give us an understanding of who the Ayore are, so that we can begin to have that sense of relationship and connection with another worldview, another perspective? And I think there's a lot of things that can be taken from this story. But one of the things that I think is interesting, and I'm sure you guys have already all gotten here as intelligent and wonderful of an audience as you are, and being the tapir aficionados who know all kinds of trivia about tapirs, I'm sure you've already figured out that the tapir is an herbivore. But now you have, right? And so as such, you might also be able to think, Oh, why would that be important? If you are a gardener or somebody who does agriculture in this community, you might understand the importance of fertilizer from an herbivore. And that is a connection that, to me, is a deeply scientific connection that's very, very, very true and has been passed down generation after generation after generation. And I think about people who take classes on what you use for fertilizer, and this is something that you would have learned as a kid, like your ABCs, right? And I think that in addition to that, as we think about that story and what that story holds, any of you who've taken a survival class or been in the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts, you know how important it is to have a list of all the things that you can eat. Right? If you've seen Into the Wild, you understand this is very important to know what you should be able to eat. And so this provides that. And there's other things that I have found as I've learned about understanding the story in connection to the Ayore. And it's a story I don't think I would have opened up had I not had my encounter with Jaime. Had I not learned to dig a little bit further into something past its packaging. And so I would really encourage you, especially after a day like today, there are so many conversations that are starting today. And there are so many stories that will be able to come out of today and the things you've heard and the invitations you've had and all the ways you can participate in a community dialogue. And I would encourage you as you tell stories to do that, to look past the packaging. And I would also encourage you to know that you can tell this story to other people and you don't have to worry too terribly much, because the Ayore have one of the best things about storytelling in their kind of rule of storytelling, which is make it your own. Like, read your audience, make it your own, and don't tell it the same way every single time, because they don't want the story to be dead. Tell it alive. If you can't remember a tejon, it's a squirrel. It does have to be a tapir, so remember that part. So, and I also just want to encourage you that as this conversation from things like TED Talk have gone on, you know, we've talked about a lot of things on local levels. We've looked at the ripple effects on global levels. And I would encourage you to continue to pursue that to a way in which we look at our interconnected humanity with groups of people that don't really have a voice throughout the world, like the Ayore. Thank you.